Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be diving deep into innovation and entrepreneurship, but not just any old way. Our guide for this deep dive is the one and only Peter Drucker, a true giant in the field of management, and someone, honestly, whose ideas still feel like surprisingly relevant today, even though he wrote this, decades ago.
Yeah. And it's amazing how Drucker really kind of predicted this whole shift towards like an entrepreneurial economy way back when. I mean, everyone was still talking about like, big corporations like corporate America being the dominant
Yeah,
force.
absolutely. And he saw it way beyond just like the tech world too. He argued that small businesses, like, the backbone of our communities, were actually becoming the real driving force.
Yeah.
Like he predicted the whole side hustle thing way before it was even a thing.
Right. It's wild. And that's where his whole idea of management being the real technology comes in, right? He's saying that it's not just about having the latest gadgets or whatever. It's about having the skills to like systematically innovate and create value. And that's what's becoming more and more important in this new, entrepreneurial world.
So like instead of just waiting around for, a brilliant idea to strike you out of the blue, Drucker believed anyone could actually like learn to
Yeah.
be more innovative. And he lays out these 7 sources of innovation, which I got to admit, when I first read them seemed kind of like dry and academic.
Yeah, I get that. They do sound a bit like, something out of a textbook. But when you actually start to think about them in like the context of today's world, they really come alive. Like take the source he calls unexpected successes.
Yeah.
Does that even still apply in our like data obsessed world
Yeah.
where everyone's tracking and analyzing everything?
That's such a good question. I mean, you'd think with all this data, there wouldn't be many surprises left, right? But I think what Drucker was getting at is like, even in this, super data-driven world, there will always be those anomalies, like those outliers that just don't fit the neat little patterns we expect.
Absolutely. And those anomalies, they often point to some kind of shift in the market or like a change in how people are behaving that maybe the data hasn't quite caught up with yet. You remember that example he gives about RH Macy's and their unexpected boom in appliance sales?
Oh, yeah. They actually wanted to stop selling them
Yeah,
because it wasn't part of their core business, right?
right. Exactly. But it turned out to be this sign of like a much bigger trend, the rise of the middle class and their desire for all these modern conveniences.
Okay, so unexpected successes, check. Still relevant. But what about incongruities? Drucker defines that as like these mismatches between what people assume and what's actually happening.
Sure.
Has that become like more or less important in driving innovation today?
Hmm. I think in some ways, incongruities have become even more important as a driver of innovation. Like, look at the healthcare industry, for example. Drucker used the high cost of hospital care in the US as an example of an incongruity, which then led to the rise of, specialized outpatient clinics.
Right. But that was decades ago.
Yeah.
And now, with telehealth and remote monitoring and all that, we're seeing this whole new wave of innovation that's driven by like this gap between how healthcare has traditionally been delivered and what people actually need and want in this, digitally connected world.
Yeah, and it's not just healthcare, right? You see these incongruities everywhere you look, like in education, transportation, even in how we like consume entertainment. It's crazy.
It's like those moments where you suddenly think, wait, why are we still doing things this way? And that's often when the most interesting innovations happen. Okay, so let's move on to another one of Drucker's sources, process need. He describes it as basically fixing a weak link in a process. Do any like modern day examples of that come to mind?
Oh, tons. Just look at the whole world of logistics and supply chain management. Drucker uses the example of those roll-off ships that helped address port congestion,
Right.
which was a huge innovation, like back then. But now with, the explosion of e-commerce and this whole demand for like same-day delivery, you've got companies like Amazon that are constantly having to innovate around process needs.
I know, it blows my mind to think about all the like crazy algorithms and robotics that go into getting that package from the warehouse to my doorstep in like a matter of hours. It's insane.
It's pretty wild. And it's not just about speed either. It's also about like sustainability, right?
Yeah.
Companies are realizing that they have to find more efficient ways to move stuff around the world in ways that are, better for the planet.
Okay, so process need is definitely still a major driver of innovation, especially as the world just keeps getting like more complex and interconnected. All right, let's talk about changes in industry and market structure. This one just seems like a no-brainer in today's world, right?
Yeah, it's almost like Drucker had a crystal ball or something.
Okay.
Think about how the internet and like e-commerce have totally upended entire industries. Brick and mortar retail has had to adapt or die. You've got the music industry like completely reinventing itself with digital downloads and streaming. And now with AI and automation coming on strong, I mean, we're on the verge of another massive wave of disruption. It's kind of scary, honestly.
It's definitely both exciting and a little bit terrifying, right? The pace of change is just accelerating so fast. And if you're not constantly adapting and innovating, you're going to get left behind.
That's the name of the game in the entrepreneurial economy. Okay, so we've covered the four sources of innovation that Drucker considers internal to a business. Let's move on to the external ones, starting with demographics. I have a feeling this one might be especially interesting to you.
Oh, absolutely. Demographics are fascinating to me. It's like watching this like slow motion wave crashing over society and just changing everything in its path. Drucker's example of Melville's shoe targeting the teenage market during the baby boom is just classic. They saw the wave coming and rode it all the way to the bank.
And we're seeing similar things happening today, right? Like with the aging of the population in a lot of developed countries. Companies are scrambling to adapt their products and services to cater to like the needs of an older demographic.
Right. And then you've got the rise of like millennials and Gen Z consumers who have totally different expectations and values compared to, previous generations. They're digital natives, more socially conscious, and way more likely to be influenced by like peer recommendations than traditional advertising.
Absolutely. Companies that don't get that are going to have a tough time.
It's like trying to sell cassette tapes to someone who grew up with Spotify. It's just not going to happen.
No. Okay, so the next source of innovation that Drucker talks about is changes in perception, mood, and meaning. This one can be a bit more subtle and tricky to really pin down.
It's like trying to catch the zeitgeist,
Yeah.
the spirit of the times.
Yeah.
Drucker uses the example of William Benton marketing encyclopedias by tapping into this, like, growing desire for upward mobility.
Right.
People's aspirations were changing,
Yeah.
and he saw an opportunity there. How do you see this playing out in today's world?
I think social media plays a huge role, right? I mean, trends emerge and spread like wildfire, and companies have to be super agile to keep up.
Oh, for sure. The whole concept of influencer marketing is basically built around this idea that people are more likely to buy something if someone they admire recommends it.
Exactly. And it's not just about products either, right? It's about values. Consumers are way more discerning now. They want companies to like align with their values on things like, sustainability, social justice, and ethical sourcing.
It's not enough to just have a great product anymore. You need a great story, a compelling mission that like resonates with your audience.
Absolutely. Okay, so finally we come to the seventh, and arguably the most powerful source of innovation, new knowledge. This is where Drucker really emphasizes that, like, truly groundbreaking innovation. It often takes a long time to, like, develop and actually come to fruition.
Yeah, he uses the examples of the transistor and the computer, which took like decades to go from, scientific breakthroughs to these mass market technologies that like changed the world. Are we seeing similar long lead times with innovations today?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Think about the field of, like, biotechnology, for example. Scientists have been working on gene editing and personalized medicine for decades, and we're only just starting to see some of those innovations translate into, actual treatments. And the same thing's happening with AI. We're still in the early stages, but the potential is just massive.
It's like we're planting these seeds today that might not fully bloom for another 20 or 30 years. Crazy to think about.
Yeah, and that's what makes innovation so exciting and challenging at the same time.
Right.
It's about having this long-term vision and being willing to invest in ideas that might not pay off for years or even decades. And, this is something Drucker really drives home when he moves from talking about the sources of innovation to the actual practice of entrepreneurship.
Right. So he's established that innovation is more than just like a bright idea. It's an actual discipline. But how does that translate to the like nitty-gritty of starting and running a business?
That's where things get really interesting and where Drucker, I think, offers some of his most valuable insights. One of the things that always like struck me about Drucker's work is His emphasis on the difference between managing like an established business versus managing like a startup. Like you might think, hey, management is management, right? But he really saw those as like two different things.
Well, yeah, I mean, isn't managing any business, like whether it's big or small, about taking risks and adapting to change and all that?
You're right. Those are like essential skills in any business. But what Drucker's saying is that like in a startup, in an entrepreneurial venture, those things are like absolutely critical for survival. There's a way higher tolerance for uncertainty. There's this constant need to like pivot and adjust your strategy based on what the market's telling you.
It's almost like you're on this like crazy roller coaster that's constantly throwing you new loops and twists.
Exactly. You have to be like okay with that kind of unpredictable ride. But the interesting thing is that Drucker also believed that like even big established companies, the ones that are usually associated with stability and all that, they could actually benefit from adopting like a more entrepreneurial mindset.
That sounds kind of like a paradox,
Okay.
right? Because, I mean, big companies are usually all about stability, hierarchy, being risk averse. So how do you like inject that entrepreneurial spirit into something that's, well, kind of the opposite?
Well, that's where these three key principles come in. He calls them abandonment, opportunity focus, and separation. They sound kind of, abstract at first, but they're actually pretty practical when you really break them down.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Let's start with abandonment. That sounds a little intense, honestly. Is he talking about, like, firing everyone and starting over from scratch?
No, not quite. It's more about like systematically letting go of the stuff that's no longer serving the company. So that could be, outdated products, services, processes, anything that's like draining resources and holding the company back from growth, which, can be a really tough decision, especially for companies that have been successful doing things a certain way for like a long time.
It's like having that closet full of clothes you never wear.
Yeah.
You know you should get rid of them, but there's always that little bit of, like, sentimental attachment.
For sure. And that's where strong leadership is so important, right? You need someone who can make those tough calls, who can see the bigger picture and say, look, we got to let go of the past if we want to make room for the future.
Okay, that makes sense. So abandonment is about, like, decluttering and streamlining.
Mhm.
What about opportunity focus? Is that just like a fancy way of saying, look for the bright side?
It's more than that. It's about actively like looking for and analyzing those areas where the company is already exceeding expectations. It's about asking, okay, what's working really well and how can we do more of that? Because a lot of times, companies get so caught up in fixing problems and putting out fires that they miss those like little nuggets of success that could actually point to like a whole new avenue for growth.
So it's kind of like taking those, what was it, unexpected successes we talked about earlier,
Okay.
and turning them into a deliberate strategy.
Exactly. You're turning those happy accidents into like a repeatable process for innovation. And then we have separation, which I think is especially relevant in today's world where like technology is changing so rapidly.
I'm sensing a theme here with abandonment and separation.
Yeah.
It's like Drucker saying, if you want to innovate, you kind of need to create some distance from, like, the day-to-day operations of the core business.
Sure. We're getting it. It's about recognizing that innovation often happens best, like outside of the normal corporate structure, outside those constraints.
So you're saying you need to give those innovative teams, like, the freedom to operate differently, to experiment and take risks, without getting bogged down by all the bureaucracy.
Right. It's like creating this little like incubator,
Right.
within the larger company, where there are different rules, different metrics for success, and a different culture that really encourages creativity and, taking risks.
I love that analogy of the incubator. It's like giving those, fledgling ideas a safe space to, like, grow and develop before they're ready to fly on their own.
Exactly. Now, once you have that entrepreneurial spirit kind of cultivated, whether you're a small startup or a giant corporation, Drucker talks about 4 distinct strategies that entrepreneurs typically use. He calls them fustest with the mostest, hit them where they ain't, or creative imitation, entrepreneurial judo, and ecological niches.
Okay, those names definitely have my attention. Let's break them down one by one, starting with fustest with the mostest. That sounds like something straight out of, like, a Wild West movie.
It does have that like bold frontier spirit to it, right? It's essentially about aiming for market dominance with like a totally groundbreaking innovation. You're going all in trying to be the first and the biggest.
So high risk, high reward.
Oh yeah, definitely. And the examples Drucker gives are classic. You've got DuPont with nylon, which, revolutionized the textile industry. and Dr. Wang and the word processor, which
Yeah.
they completely changed the way we work with documents.
Yeah, those are some pretty heavy hitters. It makes you wonder if that kind of like fustest with the mostest strategy is even still possible in today's world.
Yeah.
I mean, everything moves so fast now. There's so much competition.
It's definitely harder to achieve that kind of like total market dominance for sure, but we still see it happening. Like look at Tesla and the electric car market. They came in with this like bold vision, a real commitment to innovation, and they've managed to like disrupt a very established industry.
Okay, so fustest with the mostest is still alive and well, maybe just a bit harder to pull off. What about hit 'em where they ain't? That one sounds a little more, I don't know, sneaky.
Well, it's not necessarily sneaky, but it's definitely more like strategic. It's about recognizing that you don't always have to be the first to market with something. Sometimes it's actually better to let someone else, kind of blaze the trail, learn from their mistakes, and then come in with a better, improved version of, whatever they're offering.
So it's like being the second mouse to get the cheese, but making sure you grab the biggest piece.
Huh. That's a perfect analogy. Drucker gives the example of acetaminophen, which was actually developed in Germany, but it didn't really take off until it was like reintroduced and marketed effectively in the US.
So it's not just about the product itself. It's about how you position it, how you market it, and how you like find that sweet spot in the market where you can really thrive.
Exactly. All right, now entrepreneurial judo. This is one of my favorites. It's all about like using your opponent's strength against them.
Ooh, okay, I'm all ears. Sounds like we're getting into some serious like martial arts strategy here.
Right. It's about exploiting the weaknesses and blind spots of like bigger, more established companies. You know that story of David and Goliath?
Oh yeah, classic underdog story.
Well, entrepreneurial judo is basically about being that like nimble, resourceful David who can outmaneuver the big, slow, lumbering Goliath. And a perfect example of this is Sony and the transistor radio.
Oh yeah, they basically created a whole new market for like portable radios that the big companies had totally overlooked.
And they did it by being innovative and adaptable, right? They weren't afraid to like take risks and experiment with new technologies. And that's a key takeaway from this strategy. You got to be willing to challenge the status quo and find those like gaps in the market where you can gain an advantage.
So it's like finding that, I don't know, hidden pressure point that can bring down even the mightiest giant.
Exactly. Okay, and then we have the fourth strategy, ecological niches. This one's all about finding that specialized area of the market that's less attractive to the big players, and then like becoming the dominant force in that niche.
So instead of trying to be everything to everyone, you're focusing on being like the absolute best in the world at this one specific thing.
Right. It's like saying, we're not going to try to compete with Walmart. We're going to be the best darn shoe store like in the entire state.
And sometimes that hyper specialization can be like a really powerful competitive advantage, right? You
Yeah.
become the go-to expert, the trusted source for that one particular thing.
For sure. Drucker gives the examples of A.O. Smith, which makes car frames, and Robert Bosch, which originally focused on like electrical systems for cars.
Yeah.
Not exactly glamorous businesses, but
Yeah.
they dominate their little niches.
And that's the beauty of ecological niches, right? You can build a really successful, sustainable business by focusing on like a very specific need in the market and just becoming the absolute best at meeting that need.
As we've been talking about all these different strategies, it's interesting to me how they're all like very focused on products and services. But then Drucker goes beyond that and talks about something he calls changing values and characteristics.
Yeah, you're right. This is where things get even more nuanced, I guess. He's not just talking about what you're selling. He's talking about like how you frame it, how you position it in the market,
Okay.
and how you connect it to like people's actual needs and values.
So it's about innovation at like a deeper level, almost like a shift in perception or a reframing of the problem itself. Yeah, exactly. And some of the examples he gives are just brilliant. Like take Roland Hill and the Postal Service. He didn't invent the Postal Service, but he like totally transformed it by making it affordable and accessible to everyone.
He shifted the focus from like the sender to the receiver by making the recipient pay for the postage.
Right.
It's amazing how like a simple change like that can have such a huge impact. And it just totally disrupted the existing model.
Another great example is Gillette and the safety razor. Their real innovation wasn't so much the razor itself, but the business model. They priced the shaves, not the razors, by selling like inexpensive razors and then making their money on the replacement blades.
Genius. They created a recurring revenue stream before that was even a thing.
Totally. And then there's Cyrus McCormick and the invention of installment buying. His harvesting machine was a game changer for farmers. But most farmers, they couldn't afford to pay for it all up front. So he came up with a way to finance the purchase, basically letting farmers pay for the machine over time out of, the increased profits they were earning because of the machine.
It was like an early form of venture capital or like microfinancing almost.
Yeah.
He basically invented a whole new financial model to make his innovation, accessible to a wider market.
And then there's Lennox, the China company. And their creation of the bridal registry.
Ah, yes, the bridal registry. A stroke of pure genius that's probably saved countless couples from, like, awkward gift-giving situations.
But it was also, like, a brilliant business move because Lennox realized that their China wasn't just, like, a product. It was tied to this, really emotional and significant event in people's lives. And they tapped into that emotional value and created, like, a whole new market.
They understood the power of, like, storytelling and symbolism. They weren't just selling plates and cups. They were selling like a dream, a vision of a happy future. And that, I think, is really what Drucker's talking about with changing values and characteristics. It's about finding that deeper meaning, that emotional connection that makes your product or service truly valuable.
It's about innovation that goes like way beyond the surface level.
Yeah.
And taps into something much deeper.
It's funny, as we've been like going through all these different strategies and examples, I keep thinking about how Drucker's ideas, they go way beyond like just the nuts and bolts of starting a business. He's really talking about like a whole new way of organizing society, what he calls the entrepreneurial society.
Yeah. And this is where his work becomes like even more relevant to us today, right? He wasn't just focused on like the mechanics of business. He was really concerned with how these big economic shifts were going to impact people and communities.
And one of the things he kept coming back to was this idea of like continuous learning, the need to keep learning and relearning throughout your life. It's almost like he predicted this whole gig economy thing and the rise of like freelancing and remote work. And
right? It's kind of mind-blowing how like prescient he was. Because, in the past you could like learn a trade or get a degree and pretty much just coast on that knowledge for your whole career. But those days are over.
So now we all have to become like lifelong learners,
right?
Constantly adapting and picking up new skills if we want to stay relevant. It's almost like we're all entrepreneurs now, even if we're like technically working for someone else.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it. We all need to develop that like entrepreneurial mindset, that ability to like see opportunities, take initiative, and be comfortable with, uncertainty and change.
Like that saying, the only constant is change. But now it feels like that change is happening, like at warp speed.
Exactly. And that brings us to another important point that Drucker makes about the role of like government and policy in creating a, truly entrepreneurial society.
Yeah.
He was really critical of certain tax policies that he felt were actually like discouraging innovation and risk-taking.
So he was advocating for like a more business-friendly environment, one that, rewards companies for investing in new ideas and technologies.
Yeah, but it goes beyond that. He believed that government policies should also support like creating a dynamic and adaptable workforce, which means investing in education and training programs that help people, develop those skills they need to actually succeed in this like rapidly changing economy.
Like that whole teach a man to fish
Yeah.
thing, right? Instead of just giving them a fish, you're giving people the tools they need to like create their own opportunities.
Exactly. And it's not just about job skills either. It's also about fostering like a culture of creativity, innovation, critical thinking.
So it's about education reform, but also about this like broader shift in mindset, right?
Totally. And that's, I think, one of the most challenging things about building a truly entrepreneurial society. It's not just about changing laws. It's about changing like attitudes and beliefs. It's about creating a culture that actually embraces risk, that celebrates, failure as a learning opportunity.
Yeah.
And that really values lifelong learning.
So it's almost like a cultural revolution, right? This shift away from the traditional idea of like stability and security towards a more dynamic and entrepreneurial way of life.
I love that. That's a great way to put it. And it's not going to be an easy transition, right? It requires us to like embrace uncertainty, to step outside our comfort zones, and to, constantly challenge the status quo.
But it's also super exciting. I mean, think about all the amazing things that have been created because people were willing to like think differently, to challenge those assumptions and, to take a leap of faith.
That's the entrepreneurial spirit. It's about seeing the world not just as it is, but as it could be. and then having the courage to go out there and make it happen.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Peter Drucker's innovation and entrepreneurship, I'm feeling, honestly, a mix of challenge and like real possibility. It's clear that we're living in a time of, massive change, and that demands new ways of thinking and doing things.
And Drucker's work gives us this really powerful framework, I think, for navigating this new world. He reminds us that innovation is not just about technology, it's about people. It's about, fostering that culture of creativity and adaptability and lifelong learning.
It's about empowering people to become the architects of their own futures, really, to see themselves as entrepreneurs, no matter what their job title is or what path they're on.
It's about embracing that entrepreneurial spirit, like as a way of life.
So I want to leave our listeners with this question. What opportunities for innovation do you see in your own life? In your work, in your community? What assumptions are you holding on to that might be like outdated? Or maybe even holding you back?
Don't be afraid to, challenge the status quo. Don't be afraid to fail. And most importantly, never stop learning and growing.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it sparked some new ideas and maybe even inspired you to embrace that entrepreneurial spirit in your own life. Thanks for listening.